It's my honor to introduce officially Rabbi Larry Hoffman this morning. And I want us to get right to his talk, but first I have to say, not only is Rabbi Hoffman a rabbi of rabbis, a scholar among scholars, but he is a heart among hearts. And it is said by the rabbis that a teacher with enough of an open heart and a willingness to teach can become like one who raised you. So I'm honored this morning to invite up someone who raised me as a rabbi and who in so many ways has been a godparent to Temple Micah. We are blessed to receive his teaching this morning. He will teach about the High Holy Days, and like all his teachings, will really be teaching us about what is true in the human experience, what we long for and strive for, and what we have potential to be and do in the world.
Wow. Back home again, in front of you all and with you. Shabbat Shalom. Last night, in a little talk, Tacola, I called it, right? We talked about, it's not on? I think I'm on. Yeah? Can you hear me? Yeah. It's working? Good, good. So last night we talked about something very important, which was what's the nature of humanity? And that's what I tried to say last night, that we can get lost in the details of Jewish teaching and forget about what they're all about. That's easy to do. But the real question at this time of year is, who are we? I mean, what makes us tick? Are we sinners? Do we sin? Do you actually believe in sin? Just for the fun of it, how many people think there is such a thing as sin? Can you put your hand up? Like, how many people aren't sure? How many people think there really isn't? Yeah, so this is one of the big questions for Jews because we don't talk about sin very much. So much depends upon your culture, you know, how you've been raised. I can give the same talk in a church, and guess how many people will put their hand up and say they believe in sin, right? Doesn't mean they're worse or better than we are. It's all a question of what language you feel comfortable using. It's also a question of whether there is an entity to which the language refers. Now, language doesn't automatically refer to something. Even if I say that's a chair, it doesn't automatically a chair. It's just that we decided to call it a chair. And you can imagine all kinds of different confabulations of a chair. What if I sat on a piano? Would it become a chair? What if normally we all sat on the piano because it was an old piano and we put it here because we like to have families sitting there? Is it their family chair? So we decide how language gets used. But once we call something, whatever it is, it takes on a different quality. So the question isn't, in a way, I gave you the wrong question. See, I said, is there such a thing as a sin? The real question is there such a thing in human behavior that you think is useful to call a sin as opposed to something else? I got into a dialogue. I almost had a fight. It wasn't a fight. It was a dialogue with a very nice psychiatrist about 30 years ago. On a television program that we were doing in dialogue, and I used the word sin, and he said to me, I don't believe in sin. And I said, you don't? No, he said, I think there are mistakes people make. So I said, everything wrong is a mistake? Well, you know, we can train people not to do those things. It's useless. In fact, it's dysfunctional to call it a sin. Let's think about that. Is it useful then to call something a sin? That's the question. Judaism thinks there is, to the extent that in fact it has different words for sin, all kinds of things. Because there are some things that are horrendous. There's some things that are not. Maybe they're not sins, they're mistakes. There are things we do by accident or by mistake, it's true. And there's a different word for that. And then there are things that are just awful. So I do think, my own view, is that it's worthwhile to think about what counts as a sin and what lowers us as human beings because we have somehow willingly even done them. Well, we're going to look at a variety of texts today about sin. Many of them Jewish, a few of them Christian, and some of them just good old interesting stuff that people threw up somewhere and I happen to have. What a coincidence, right? So I want you to take a look at our text today. Look at, first of all, the title page. So this is Temple Micah in anticipation of the new year. And I hope the whole point of my being here at this time with you, may this weekend of study bring blessings of sweetness, goodness, and kindness upon all of you and upon our world entire. That's the point of it all. So now let's look at the next page. And I'm going to ask you, I think I have to read the stuff out loud because of the Zoom. Is that right? We can't have other people read it. They won't pick it up. Is that right? Okay, so I'll pretend I'm you. Would you like to read? I would. Yes, thank you. Now what I want you to do as we read these things, I want you to think about the theological consequences of even the silliest one of these comments. By theology, I mean, what can we assume the writer who wrote this might have believed about God? But alternatively, part of theology is not God, but part of theology is what I called yesterday anthropology. Not the doctrine of God, but a doctrine of human nature. What is anthropos? What are we as human beings like? So the question might be, what does the author think about, humans? Or it could be, what does the author think about God? Or it could even be, what does the author think about the universe and all that's out there? I want to think of theology in three ways then. Theology, a doctrine of theos, God. Anthropology, a doctrine of human nature, anthropos, right? And the third one is cosmology, not the stuff that the scientists do that I wish I knew, and if I did, maybe I wouldn't be standing here. But the stuff that we ordinary people think about. What's it like out there? Is the world good for us or bad? Is it good to have been born into the world? The rabbis ask that question. Given all the tourists, is it good to have been born, or would it have been better if we hadn't? What's the world like out there? Is there such a thing as progress? Is the world helpful to us, and so on and so forth? So let's just have kind of a go at how you look at a text, and then you see what's underneath it, all right? Here's the first one. John Steinbeck, you know him? He has someone say in The Grapes of Wrath, there ain't no sin and there ain't no virtue. There's just stuff people do. What can we learn from that? If you can kind of help me here, you just kind of blurt out what you think this means. He might have believed it, and I'll repeat it because of the Zooming. Hello, people on Zoom. I wish I could see you. Okay, yeah.
People do good stuff and bad stuff.
People do good stuff and bad stuff.
The question is bad stuff sin?
Question is bad stuff sin? Perfect. Anyone else? Yes.
Much about God.
Not much about God. No, that's correct. It's just what we do. That's right. All right. John Steinbeck is a thoughtful writer, as we know. Francis Chan. Anybody know Francis Chan? Yes? Yeah, Francis Chan then writes the following. This is a thoughtful writer. Because God hates sin, he has to punish those guilty of sin. Maybe that's not an appealing standard. But to put it bluntly, when you get your own universe, you can make your own standards. All right, so what does Francis Chan think? What's her back, what? Even the silliest, even the kind of tongue-in-cheek may have some significant belief behind it. What do you guess she would say about the universe, God, humans? We're each in our own universe, okay? That which would mean we each could have our own standards, right? All right, could be, yeah.
I was puzzled by this. He has to. Who's making God have to do that?
Very interesting. That's correct. You could hate sin but not have to. You could decide to, right? Or you could decide, hey, that's just the way you are. Yeah.
This is why I'm not evangelical.
This is why you're not evangelical. Yes, because Francis Chan is an evangelical. That's correct.
Take it, don't ask questions.
Yeah.
God doesn't care what you think.
Interesting. Okay, so here we get Saadia Gaon. I know a lot more about Saadia Gaon than I know about Francis Chan. Saadia Gaon is one of the great scholars of Jewish tradition, a rabbi in 10th century. Gaon. The Gaon in those days, what that meant was, this was the chief rabbi of the world, so to think. I mean, so to speak. Lived in Babylonia, was a great writer, a philosopher, a grammarian, an enlightened thinker, and so on. And he says, sin is not sinful because God forbade it. God forbade it because it is sinful. What do you think of that? Circular?
It seems like it takes away agency from God,
It takes away agency from God.
as though God is being compelled.
Or God is the one with the deepest understanding of the universe. God is the one who really gets it.
God gets it. Yeah, God really gets it. It's a very profound question. I mean, are there things that are innately evil, period? Even if God hadn't defined it, they're just evil. That's the latter. God forbade it because it is sinful. You don't have to believe in God. Even if you think God didn't name anything as a sin, it's sinful. So for people who don't want to believe in God even, and therefore say, we can do anything, right? That was Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky believed that, he said, if a single child dies, then there is no God. And if there is no God, maybe there's really no evil, because God determines the evil. Saadia thought of that. And so Saadia's point is, you don't have to believe in God to believe in evil. You just have to believe in evil. Just look at the world. And God being God, right? God being God forbids it. But first is the evil. Yeah.
So much more appealing God than Francis Chan.
Pardon me?
So much more appealing God than Francis Chan.
Yes.
It begs the question for me though, if evil exists outside of God and good exists outside of God.
Aha. So if evil is outside of God, independent, it just is, then is good also outside of God? It just is. What do you think? I say yes. In other words, Saadia is saying there's something about good and evil that is just existent. And you don't have to go to God to discover it. There's something internal that we can tell ourselves, perhaps. We can just see it. And God, as it were, names it. It puts a great deal of emphasis on our ability to see into ourselves. And it puts the responsibility on us. Suppose I publish a law. And suppose you don't believe in me as a lawgiver. And you say, yeah, I deny, you don't have the right to make that law. Does that mean you don't have to keep the law? Saadia's answer is it does not mean that at all, because the law itself might in and of itself be good or bad, could be evil, could be good. So the ultimate question is there such a thing as good and evil that's inherent in the universe, in our being? And Saadia, who believes in God, I mean, he's the chief rabbi of forever, right? But nonetheless, he wants to say it doesn't depend on God. It's there, part of the universal structure of things. Okay, Mark Twain is not quite of the same philosophical ilk, but nonetheless, it was a place of sin, loose women, whiskey and gambling. There was no place for a good Presbyterian, and I did not long remain one. A little more entertaining, Saadia, but what's this all about then? Put this one together with number. With Saadia? Yeah, it is about free will. It certainly is. That's correct. This also raises a different issue, And that issue is something we haven't talked about yet, but will be part of our discussion this morning. Not just what constitutes a good person, but what constitutes a good social milieu, what constitutes a good culture, a good society. And here the society is loose women, of course, he's sexist about all that, but all right. Whiskey and gambling, and no place, he was Presbyterian, for good Presbyterian. We're talking about the impact of culture on ourselves, right? It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And how Lot lives in Sodom, and Lot, who after all is Abraham's kin, nonetheless sins, and he sins because he's taken in by the culture of the place. So the underlying assumption here is that human beings need to live in a good society, or else they're likely to fall prey to sin, which, as you say, according to Sajid, is an existent thing. Charles Perkins Gilman, take a look at this one. As for Mother Eve, I wasn't there and can't deny the story. But I will say this, if she brought evil into the world, it is men who have had the lion's share of keeping it going ever since. Yeah, it's Sajid. I'll buy that. All right, now we're going to get. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Can I just go back for a second? The last two sort of raised me the question of when you talk about certain sin as inherent, and you have to be really careful because it's sort of a judgment. Because the Mark Twain quote, some people would say it's sin, but some people would say, it's part of the world. Whereas murder, something, there's some sort of a, I don't know if you say a conflict, but you have to be careful about what.
Are you thinking, when you say, you contrast Mark Twain's statement with murder, let's say,
Yeah.
right? And are you thinking?
With the previous, I mean, it's like what, certain ones I think we've all would recognize inherent as sin, other ones become much more subjective, sliding scale.
Yeah, so there is some things are so obviously sinful. Others we would say, well, is it a sin or isn't it? It's more subjective, right? And so that raises the level of the different kinds of behavior that I talked about at the beginning, where Judaism does differentiate various types of things that you would do, some of which are clearly sin, and terrible, and awful. Some things it's not quite clear. Some things are easier to get off your chest and to atone about. Others are much more serious, so you're right. And there is a matter of human judgment. Even if we could say God calls sin because they are evil, unfortunately God doesn't tell us what's going through God's mind at the time. So we have to make those judgments ourselves. That is true. We're now going to look at some Christian texts. And once again, I always hesitate to compare Judaism and Christianity because I don't want to treat either one of them lightly. When people talk about Judaism, and they're not Jews and Jewish scholars, they sometimes do an injustice to what we are because they don't get the fullness of it. And I understand that I don't get the fullness of Christianity either, so I'm hesitant. On the other hand, I spend a great deal of time with Christian teachings, and I am in dialogue regularly with Christian theologians, and it's not like I know nothing about it. But as I make the distinction, you should not say, oh, look how good we are, look how awful they are. That's not my point. My point is simply there are different ways of looking at the universe, and when you find your way into a faith community, the Christian term, when you find your way in a faith community, you identify with that point of view. One of the things about Judaism is I identify with that. I was born into it as it happens. I could equally well have converted into it or just be someone familiar with it. But I chose it because I like what it is. I do not like as much what I take to be the prominent Christian view. I say prominent because there's no single Jewish view and there's no single Christian view. And in fact, probably if you talk to my Christian friends with whom I'm closest, they would probably much agree with me on most things. You know, we agree with one another. But there is nonetheless, let's say it, the classic view. And so there's a classic Jewish view and a classic Christian view. Think of that as the magnet, the magnetic force. The classic Christian view is the magnetic force around which Christian teaching is based. And there's a magnetic force that draws like iron filings, Jewish interpretations, and we overlap at times, but still there's something to be said about the two classic views, because in a way we know who we are when we know who we're not. I never became so clear about what Judaism was until I taught at Notre Dame. Because then I had to be clear about it. They wanted to know, what do you believe? And at that point, I could say, unlike that, this, unlike that, this. But I don't mean to denigrate either position, just to be clear. Let's look at Paul. Christianity is what it is because of Paul. So Paul says, death came into the world through one man, Adam, and death came through sin. And so death spread to all, through one man, because all men sinned. But just as about one man's disobedience, Adam, the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience, Jesus, the many will be made righteous. The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. What I'm interested in is the first few lines. Why do we sin? Because we have inherited it from Adam. Or as Paul says elsewhere in 2b, since death came through a human being, the resurrection of the dead has also come through a human being. For as all died in Adam, so all will be made alive in Christ. All died in Adam. So death is itself a punishment of sin, and the humans wouldn't have died had they not sinned. But ever since, our punishment is to die the way Adam and Eve died because of sin, and we have sin inherent in us. It becomes mostly clear in Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine to Christians, who you can see at the bottom of the page and the next page, 2c, right? One of the great thinkers of Christianity, an interesting character, as a matter of fact, in his history. He was a pagan for a long time, although that doesn't mean much. What does that mean, pagan? It's just a word we use. But he was not Christian. He was not much of anything. He was actually mostly a libertine, and spent a good deal of time enjoying what he later decided was in fact sinful behavior. And he says, after his conversion, death came into the world through one man, Adam, and death came through sin. And so death spread to all, through one man, through whom all men sinned. Now, he says men, men, men. That's a translation of, his original, this was probably written in Latin, but he means all people, to be sure. 2D will show you how this was carried through to the Middle Ages. Yesterday, do you remember yesterday? Look up for just a minute. Remember yesterday I gave you some talk about the Middle Ages? We saw that the rabbinic discovery of sin, and we're going to look a lot more at that in just a minute. The rabbinic discovery of sin caught on in the first century, remember that? And then it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and eventually I gave you Shmaria Levin and his texts, remember? But how the shtetl, where people were so afraid of sin, they had themselves whipped. Remember how awful that was? And I gave you 25 fast days that you can keep in your spare time if you feel like it. Not to mention every Monday, Wednesday, Monday after Sukkot and Pesach. Not to mention every Friday. I mean, on and on and on, right? So, in fact, you're supposed to, they didn't tell you, but you're supposed to fast during the 10 days of repentance every single day. At night you can eat, but you get the idea. So, we saw how the thing got worse and worse and worse, or better and better and better, depends if you like the idea. All right, so how here too in Christianity, it takes root in the Middle Ages. The sin of Adam was one thing, but the sin of children at their birth is quite another. So far, so good. But he says the former was the cause, the latter is the effect. That's where we would disagree. So there is somehow kind of a spiritual DNA in the classic Christian view, right? And that actually takes on a stronger sense in Protestantism under Luther. So we were only reading Catholic thought, But Martin Luther was very serious about original sin, as were the other Reformed Protestants. Now, once you think that we are sinners by birth, Judaism has to contend with that. Because Jews and Christians were in dialogue. And so the first thing we have from Judaism is from this thing called the Mechilta, which is a 2nd century midrash. Look at this. The patriarchs were without any trace of iniquity or sin. So, there. This is all part of we would call it a dialogue or a diatribe, certainly a difference of opinion. But it's not as if Jews really believed they were without sin. I mean, really? No sin? So the Babylonian Talmud weighs in. If the Holy Blessed One had entered into judgment with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would not have been able to defend themselves against the charge. So you pays your money, takes your choices. On the one hand, they didn't sin at all. What they really mean is they weren't stuck with it as an inheritance. On the other hand, bless your thing, they are so pious, they had sinned, they didn't sin, like as if any of us don't sin. Even they still couldn't defend themselves against God, and so neither can we. If you look now at the Palestinian Talmud, look at the next two things. Happy are those whose hour of death is like their hour of birth. Just as they were free from sin at birth, so may they be free from sin at death. And you see, they're threading a very careful needle, right? Yes, we sin, but two things. Tells you a lot about human nature. What are they talking about in terms of human nature here? Remember, anthropology, religious anthropology. Anyone? We are not born a sinner. That's exactly right. But we do sin, but guess what? We can be free from sin at death, right? Look now at 2H, which is similar. Babylonian Talmud. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and soul return to God who gave it. That means give it, the soul, back to God as God gave it to you in a condition of purity. You said this morning, you said, the soul which you have given, I think we read that, didn't we, that prayer? I can't remember. The soul which you have given me, O God, came pure from you, right? So now we see a finesse about human nature. There's something about us called a soul. I asked you about sin, just for the heck of it. How many people believe in a soul? How many people aren't sure? How many people do not believe in a soul? It's hard to believe in a soul because you can't see it. And because if you can't see it and you can't study it, what is the it? Is it like a unicorn? Doesn't exist. Or is there reason to believe that there's something about human beings that we cannot put our finger on, that is beyond science and beyond empirical evidence, that we can call a soul? The problem here again is language. Do we look at the soul and say, oh, look, there it is, I see it. I knew it was there all along. Like in physics, you discover a new particle, right? I mean, a few years ago, they discovered the Higgs boson particle. And they knew it was there, and they said, we got it. Well, I don't think that's the soul, but with religious terminology, we look at human nature and decide how far we will go to posit something about us. Is there something about us that is profoundly deep within, and it is our real self, and it's the soul of the thing? And is it possible that that soul, since it's not part of our body, has some independence? And can we talk, therefore, in any meaningful way about human beings being deeper than just our physical selves? It's like mind. We all know how the brain works. Well, I don't know how the brain works. But I know other people know how the brain works. And I know that even as I'm talking here, they can tell me that there's a Broca's area, and that's why I'm able to do this. And then if they were to snip it out, right? So is there also part of the brain that controls ethical behavior? I'm sure there is. But if all we are is brain function, then that does sort of make us machines. So we like to say, I have a mind to do that. I want to be mindful about things. Is there such a thing as mind? Now, we can't study mind the way we study brain function, and yet somehow we tend to think, that if we were to eliminate the word mind from our vocabulary, we would miss something about what makes us fully human. So there, what we do is we feel there's something about our humanity and we need a word for it, and we use mind. So Judaism sees something about our humanity and needs a word for it, and then refers to it as soul. What we can say about the soul varies. But at least I keep it in mind. There is such a thing about soul, I think. So at any rate, Judaism has the sense that there's a soul. There's something about human behavior that makes us want to use a new word for it, and we develop the word soul. Well, when all is said and done, however, sin becomes very prominent in Judaism. So seeing 2i, after finishing his Amidah, Rabbi Alexandri would say the following prayer. I quoted this yesterday. Master of the universe, it is well known before you that we want to do your will, so what prevents it? The yeast in the dough and subjugation to the powers that be. And last night I said subjugation to the powers that be is the same as oppression by the powers that be, but oppression need not be necessarily just the police powers. There are lots of things that oppress people, we now know, right? Black Lives Matter is all about the oppression of the African American community. And so sin takes place because we are oppressed at times, and we necessarily do what we do. And it's hard to compare that situation with people who have everything and are all free. Why do they use yeast in the dough? I think they have the sense that sin is caused by ego. And so yeast is what puffs up the dough. And when we get puffed up with our own self-importance, we think we can get away with things if things are coming to us, or we should do whatever we want. Whereas humility, I don't want to say humiliation, but a certain humbleness kind of prevents you from imagining you can do whatever you want in the world. So there's an internal cause, and there's an external cause of sin.
But yeast is the liveliness of the dough also.
That's the problem with metaphors. They only go so far. That's right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
There's also
Kathy?
something interesting going on about the different relationship of the powerless and the powerful. The idea of sin and Charlotte Perkins Gilman is saying the same thing.
Say that again.
So the yeast in the dough is the powerful, what represents, right?
Right.
And subjugation is what refers the powerless. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman
That's interesting.
talking about the different relations.
So Charlotte Perkins Gilman is thinking of women as being oppressed, do you think?
She's talking about men.
Yes, that's right. Men keep sin going because
Because it's
finish the sentence, they have power. Exactly right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly so. Thank you. Danny, how much time do we have? Remind me again.
Another good 15, 20 minutes.
Okay.
But I would say there's one thing about this last thing brought out. We want to do your will, the yeast and the dough, that the mind is of two minds, in a sense.
The mind is of two minds. That's
We
very
want,
nice.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's an inner us and there's an inner us, and the inner us
Yes, and the rabbinic term for that, of course, is a Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, right? We have these two sides, and they're constantly fighting it out. That's correct. That's well put. Of course it is. Yeah. One more comment?
Why does oppression necessarily lead to sin? Why couldn't it lead to freedom or liberation?
Oppression?
Yeah, because you want to change it into something.
Oh, I see. I suppose it's possible when you, that's well put, if we're oppressed, we don't have to sin. We can be led to be the loyal opposition, and we can fight the oppression, and we can build a better society despite the oppression. That would be ideal. I think probably the rabbis are thinking that the average person doesn't have it within them. You know, to give you an example, I mean, oppression is sort of a loaded term. I was telling somebody earlier, I don't think I told all of you this. If you do, just kind of wave me away and I'll move on. But I'm very close friends with a woman who is a Catholic woman, a nun, religious. And she, when Vatican II freed Catholic nuns from wearing a habit if they wanted to, she got rid of her habit, and she decided that she wanted to kind of head out in the world and build her own life as someone who was religious. She didn't want to just teach in one of the parochial schools, the sorts of things that most nuns were doing. She was a musician. She wanted to get a PhD in music, and she wanted to serve the world in other ways. But of course, and she could do that. But by doing it, of course, she lost all her income because she wasn't working in Catholic schools, and she had no income. And this woman, who was probably one of the most moral people I've ever met, I mean, I consider her one of my conscience, she said that at one point she was going to school, class or something, and she was hungry. And she passed a fruit stand in New York. And she just looked at the food. And she couldn't afford it. And she wanted to take some fruit steal it. And she debated. And she remembers saying to herself, it's not fair that I can't afford this. I'm hungry. And she said she almost stole fruit. Now, this is like Jean Valjean, remember? I mean, he did, right? And she said she didn't. But what if she had? How bad would that have been? So if you think of hunger as oppression, because you don't have access to what other people do in society, right? It leads the average person not to rise up in revolution because you need to at least have basic needs to be able to run the revolution. She, by the way, now runs revolutions in effect. But at the time, and she does, but at the time, that's all she could do. So I think they're thinking of that. All right, but I won't be able to do all the things I wanted to do today, so we're going to skip 3. Let me just tell you that this is called the 13 Attributes, and it talks about what God is, and maybe we'll get to it later in the afternoon. We'll see. The next one on page 4, you'll see is the confession, and we do want to read this briefly. I'm sorry, is that page 7? Yes, it's page 7. It's number 4. Now this is perfect because he read it in the Torah portion this morning. See, God works in mysterious ways. Before we even knew how to talk about this, God said, we are going to read Deuteronomy 26. And we did. So this should be familiar to you. Now, get this. This is what the remember that you read it this morning, what the farmer says. So here we go. The farmer brings the produce, remember that? And once the farmer gets the produce, this is what the farmer's supposed to say. This comes in Deuteronomy, so it's probably 7th century BCE, maybe a little later. But anyway, the farmer says, you shall declare before Adonai your God. Now comes the farmer. I removed the holy produce from my house. I gave it to the Levite. I also gave it to the stranger, the orphan, the widow, just as you commanded me. Did we read this part, or did we read just part of it? I stand corrected. God works in mysterious ways, but not always getting it right. Because we only read the first half of the chapter. This is the second half. All right, the farmer is supposed to bring all this stuff to the temple, and then the farmer talks about it. And he says, okay, God, I removed all the holy produce from my house. I gave it to the Levite, that's you. I also gave it to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, that's the tithe for the poor. Just as you commanded me. I did not transgress your precepts. I did not neglect anything. I did not eat of it while in mourning, nor did I separate any of it when I was unclean. I have not deposited any of it with the dead. Never mind what all that stuff means. The main thing is he hasn't done anything wrong. Look down, because I did nothing wrong, now what does the farmer say to God? Okay, God, we got a deal. Now it's your turn. Look down from your holy dwelling in heaven and bless your people Israel, and the soil you have given us, land flowing with milk and honey, as you swore to our fathers. Think about that. What a far cry from Yom Kippur. Where we have sinned, we have sinned. The farmer says, hey God, you wanted the stuff, you got it. I gave it to you because you made me wealthy with all this food, and the garden's coming up just great, and I gave you back whatever you wanted. So I did my share, you do your share. We got a deal here, it's called a covenant. This is what I called the piety of plenty last night. You have everything you need. You still give something back to God, and you acknowledge to God that it came from God, and even all the fact that you had all the rain and everything you needed. But now, come on, God, you owe me. What we want to see now in the next one is what happens when the rabbis take it over. If this is an early reflection when there's still a temple, number 4b. During the afternoon of the last festival of Passover, during the 4th and 7th year, they, the farmers, would make confession. What was the confession? Now here's what I want you to pay attention to is the word. What do they call this? They call it a confession. Now what they're going to do is they're going to take what we just read, and then they're going to interpret it as to what it meant. So picture the farmer saying it in the temple, just like in Deuteronomy it said he should. But now we understand what the farmer meant by it, or what the rabbis thought the farmer meant by it. But in any case, some confession. Now we saw before, there's no confession, right? So what is the farmer saying now? Does he add a real confession? Now if we could read all of it, look, you'll see there's Roman type and italics. The italics are the interpretation. We'll just read little bits of it. So, I removed all the holy produce from my house. Remember that? What does that mean, say the rabbis? It means this is the second tithe, which is the tithe for the poor, and the fruit from the 4th year of growth. Then I gave it to the Levite. Well, that's the Levite tithe. There were different tithes. And so on and so on. Now, to the stranger, orphan, and widow, what does that mean? You see it now on line 5? This is the tithe for the poor, gleanings, forgotten sheaves, and what grows in the corners of a field, even though leaving these is not a prerequisite. Look at all the ways in which what I've done helps the poor. So it goes on and on like that. Look at line 21. I did not neglect anything. That means I did not neglect to praise you and to mention your name in my praise. I gave you what you wanted. What more do you want out of me, God? And then line 36. I did according to all that you commanded me. What does that mean? It means I was happy and made others happy with the produce. So now we get to the last bit. Line 1. Look down from your holy dwelling in heaven. What does that mean? It means, hey God, we did what you required of us. Now you do what you promised us. And bless your people Israel, with sons and daughters, and the soil you have given us, and with dew and rain and offspring of cattle, a land flowing with milk and honey as you swore to our fathers, in order to make the fruit sweet. Now that's a continuation, isn't it, of what we saw in Deuteronomy. You don't see anything added here about sin. They could have said, I've done everything you wanted except of course I'm a sinner. God, you don't find that, right? Or, you know, I gave to the poor. Of course, I didn't give enough, you know, I didn't do that. You don't find any of that. And here's the thing. They call it, in line 1, a confession. My point is that in this period, just the beginning of the rabbinic period, and the temple's still standing, they still have the biblical understanding from early on. And they haven't yet gotten to the point where we're saying confessions, as we saw the second piety, the piety of penitence, I called it, right? So what do? They call this a confession. Now, if I said to you, confess, I don't expect you to say, I'm perfect. And I say, thank you. So originally, the Hebrew for confession didn't mean confession, it meant profession. To draw from another religious tradition, it meant getting right with God. In other words, okay, God, let me read you from my own book, and I'll tell you, I did it all right. Nobody would do that later on. Later on, Jews had discovered sin. And now we're going to start moving towards the kind of text that I talked about last night, where Judaism is filled with the notion of sin. Just to remind you, on line 30, we have 2 confessions. Later on this afternoon, I'm going to return to that briefly. One confession is Hashem knew, God knew, you know. That is an alphabetic acrostic. There's a separate word for each letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So the other one, I'll hate, that's a long confession for the sin which I have committed before you. You know, remember that long one, right, which you do several times? There you get a full line for every letter of the alphabet. And in fact, in our tradition, a double line for every letter of the alphabet. It's like we can't get enough of saying how we have sinned. Now, it's not that we've done all these sins. But the notion is partly what our community has, and we're part of our community. And that's the relationship between community, like Mark Twain, remember that? And the individual. And it's also the notion that we don't really know where we've sinned. But if you can run down a ritual list of it all, we'll sort of cover the ground. And there's an attempt, therefore, to get as much stuff in as you can. Now, we'll talk about that very briefly this afternoon. What I want to do today is, right now, last thing, is to talk to you about Kol Nidre. So, you all know Kol Nidre, right? We all come to hear it chanted. I don't know if you ever pay attention to what it means. And in fact, it'd be hard to know what it means since we don't print it in our prayer books generally, since we think it would be a turn-off. And mostly if you knew what it said, you wouldn't want to say it. So we like the music haunts us. But it's worth looking at the original text for a moment. What comes with piety of penitence is a fear that somehow we'll sin unknowingly about all sorts of things. And one of the things that Jews took seriously was vows, oaths. You know, we understand that because we understand the crime of perjury. Now imagine if God was the judge and the jury, and if you promise something using the language of oath, like you're on oath here. Isn't that what they say in the movies? Imagine God says, wait a minute. You said something to me, and this is perjury, because you said something that was untrue, or you promised something that you didn't fulfill. There's a great sense then that this would be terrible. And what I'm doing here is shifting the conversation from individual anthropology to the nature of the world, or the nature of human beings possibly in a group, and getting back to Mark Twain, and back to the notion of what constitutes not a good person, but what constitutes a good society. And so before we take leave of these early texts, we want to think about how Judaism has an insight into the nature of the social structure itself. What must we strive for our social structure to be so that there is no oppression and so that we can fulfill our best as being human? It's going to be shown here in an odd way, because the emphasis is going to be on the sins that we do within the social structure, particularly sins of what we would call perjury, to some extent perjury, also making promises you don't keep. But we'll come back to the larger notion in a moment. Let's just take a look at what Nidre is. So you see on page 11, I've written you a lengthy commentary, so you can go home and study it all you want. How many people here are lawyers? Put your hand up high. You can be proud lawyers. Hooray! All right. So you'll appreciate this, because this is really a legal document. It's in Aramaic, not Hebrew, because Hebrew was intended originally simply for prayers. This is a legal document. It's not a prayer, in a way. And therefore, it comes in Aramaic. Basically, it's all vows. Take a look at the top line, 1 and 2. All vows, and then I've got a bunch of Aramaic terms. These are all different kinds of vows. By line 2, you get oaths. Now, oaths are different than vows. You'll see in a moment. All of those that we have vowed or sworn or declared, you'll see what that means, or prohibited, we'll see. All those, line 5, we regret. Now here's the part that kind of you won't like, nor do I. They shall all be permitted, abandoned, put to rest, voided and made void, invalidated and made non-existent. Our vows are not vows, this is a kind of vow, are not what it is. Our oaths are not oaths. This is a legal formula that declares the various vows and oaths and so on that we have made null and void if we didn't keep them. How does that strike you? I mean, you wait till after Yom Kippur and you say, I know I promised you, but guess what? I nullified it a couple days ago. I'll pay you back. Let's just wait till after Yom Kippur. Wink, wink. I'm not doing it anymore. Invalid. So you can see that this is a difficult text for us, especially since it's still in our prayer books, to some extent. The music is anyway. Well, we want to understand it in its context. The first thing we want to do is just take a look at the detail of it. And I want you to look at the detail of it because I want you to appreciate Judaism. And Judaism is nothing if not deep. Every word here means something. The lawyers will understand what this is all about. This could have been drafted sitting in your office, at one point or another. Mark's looking at me like, really? I don't know. All right. Take a look first at number. Take a look first at number 12 on page 11. The footnotes didn't get numbered, unfortunately, but look at footnote number 12. Oh, they did? Oh, I have an earlier text. There we go. All right. You see number 12 then? A shavua? So a shavua is an oath. It's the most serious type of sacred promise. It entails explicitly or implicitly swearing in God's name. Now, there are two kinds of them. It could be assertory, asserting that such and such is true, as in bearing testimony in a court of law, or promissory, guaranteeing that one will or will not do something in the future. So this is a very technical term. It's what you say in court when you testify something happened. But what if it didn't? You're lying. Or you promise you'll do something, or you promise I'm never gonna use that. I know that you stole that, I'll never use it. I know I like it, it's really my favorite food. But I'm not gonna use it. Maybe I'll take a little bit. All right? So that's one kind of oath. All right, that's called a Shavua. I know. Now look up at number 2. 2 is a Nidre. A Nidre was originally a dedicatory vow. You dedicated something to God in practice to the temple as a sacrifice, or something to be reserved. I'm in footnote 6. Sorry, can you see it there? Yes. Yeah. Okay. I said no. I mean, yes. Look at a Nidre. You got it? Okay. So if I gave something to the temple, just to explain, I give something to the temple, and I say, God, this is for you, or this is for your priests who do your work. Okay? And then I say, I gave you too much. It's like when you give a donation. I say, you know, the Micah house, I really like the work you do. I'm going to give you $500. And then I cancel the check. Because you know what? Maybe I should only give them 50. I mean, you can't do that. All the more so if it's going to go to God, as it were. So once you've given it, it's gone. Now, so a Nidre was originally that kind of thing. Then it gets extended. You can look at it later. But to this day, frequently when knowledgeable Jews are talking to one another, I say, I'll meet you at 4 o'clock tomorrow. And then I say, joke, Beli Nidre. I don't mean this is a Nidre. Like if I don't show up, I didn't really make a vow, you know. I'm just saying let's meet at 4 o'clock. That's all. So frequently people say, I don't mean this is a Nidre. Now take a look at 7, an Isar. Just to show you the complexity of it. An Isar was originally a subcategory of a Shavua, an oath, with the connotation of being bound, either positively or negatively, to do or not do something. Eventually, it was interpreted as an independent entity, which is what happens in law. You use one term, then you use another term, and that's a little bit different, so it becomes a separate entity. And if you write a contract, you want to make sure to stipulate all possibilities, so all the stipulations go into it. All the other ones are the same thing. They are all extensions. Even sometimes words that were used instead of the original words. Like, for example, hold on a minute, look at 9. Look at footnote 9, I think. Yeah. So footnote 9, it refers up above. Can you see line 1? Koname. All right. So it's Kol Nidre, Yesore, V'harame, V'koname. So we're at Koname. We're only starting out. Koname, what is that? Well, originally, what you gave to the temple was a korban, a sacrifice. But now you don't give sacrifices in the Middle Ages. So they want a word that's like it. So they find a word that's in Greek, actually. It starts with the same sound, koname. And then some people didn't even want to say that. So look at footnote 11. Konas, that's number 11 on the second line. And that's a variant form of konam. I mean, do you see how they went to great detail. Every possible thing you could say, just in case you missed one. Now, why do I want you to see this kind of legal thinking? Because we were talking about what constitutes a good society, and for Judaism, a good society, number one, most important, it must be a society of law. So the Talmud believes that we have our covenant with God, and other nations of the world have their covenant with God. So everyone has a covenant. Well, what do you think God's covenant was with the Amorites or the Canaanites or with, in our day, with Muslims or any other community? We can't judge what's right for them. They have to determine it themselves. But we have a bottom line. And so there's certain bottom line things we expect of any society. And the first and foremost one is there has to be judges and justice. You know, imagine that. We cannot imagine a society without law and without justice. The most amazing statement, to me, almost the most amazing one in the Talmud, is a story. I don't have time to go into it. But it leads to the possibility someone thinks, oh, he didn't tell you the story, I guess. There's someone who's our great atheist, our great denier of God. And there's a story that he sees something that's unjust, I won't go into it, and he can't believe about this injustice. And so why does he turn away from God? He says, late deen, the late dayan. There's no law, and there's no judge. We cannot imagine a society in which there isn't justice. Now, when you get that, you'll end up with this legalism, and Judaism is frequently said to be overly legal. I don't think that's true. The legalism follows from the assumption that what a good society must be. It has to have judges and it has to have justice. It's so relevant now because of our Supreme Court. So insofar as we look at the court and we say, oh, there are no judges and no justice, at that point the whole society falls apart. I mean, the very essence of what society is at stake here. So I want you to see then the depth of it all. I often think, what if I were on a desert island and they gave me one book, one text to use? I would take the Talmud, without doubt. I would take the Talmud and all its commentaries. Yes, it's mostly legal, but the ins and outs of the logic and thinking of it, first of all, it deepens my understanding of what human nature is. We talked about this, as God is. And it's all wrapped up often in legal thinking. This then, to me, is an example of Judaism's depth of legal thinking. And even though we don't really worry about all these terms now, it's just an example of the way Jews, at their essence, take apart the world and put it back together again. And think of it in terms of legal categories, because if there is no law, and there is no justice, and no judge, then everything falls apart. Now, but if you've been listening, you say to me, well, wait a second. You're declaring the whole thing null and void? This is not law, this is unjust. So just the opposite of what you've been saying is in fact the case here. And so we're going to finish by looking at what the history of how this prayer came into being. You know what the prayer is, right? It took all our vows. Let's look at page 12 again. Okay? Our vows are not vows. Our isarei are not isarei. Our oaths are not oaths. Where does that come from? It comes from Mishnah in the Mishnah, you see 5b. This is a text around the year 200. This is what they meant originally. 4 kinds of vows the sages declared not binding. Vows of enticement, like when you bargain. I'm not going to give you a lower price, the best you're going to get. All right, $100 off. Let's make a deal. They knew that was okay. Vows of exaggeration, right? I saw the most wonderful thing yesterday. I bet it wasn't the most wonderful. All right, it was nice. That you're allowed to exaggerate, right? Vows made in error. Well, we sometimes promise things in error. And broke vows that we break under constraint. We just had to do it. They forced us into it. Out of that, there comes a notion that maybe we should annul some vows at least. So look at the Babylonian Talmud 5c. Look at, so we'll cut to the chase because we don't have a lot of time. First of all, well, line 20, I guess. If someone wants to prevent his vows for the year from being valid, let him arrive at Rosh Hashanah and declare every vow which I may make in the future shall be null and void. In other words, people know you didn't mean it in advance, so then when you say it, they won't trust you. Okay. But you can't annul something in the past. And in any event, look at line 26. The Mishnah, that's where we get this teaching above, a 5b, deliberately obscures the matter so that people will not treat vows lightly. And what happened was, it starts at 24, I guess. Rav Huna, see it there? Rav Huna Bar Chinana wanted to announce the procedure at a public lecture, and Rava said to him, the Mishnah obscures the matter, so people won't treat vows lightly, and you want to announce it at a public lecture? So you can see there's some sense that, yeah, I know we can do it, but don't tell anyone. Where then did it come from? The Talmud didn't like it, and yet we do it. 5b. We've discovered magic incantation bowls from the 4th to the 7th century that the population at large were using. They were afraid that they might have vowed something or other, and so on those bowls, they would make a bowl out of pottery, and then they'd inscribe on it the following, and then they'd break the pottery. Let health and protection and healing from heaven be unto Shiroi ben Burzin, whoever that is, or any name that the son of Burzin might have. Blessed be the Lord of creatures. By this counter charm do I disenchant, and in the name of this true one do I annul all vows and curses and knocks and spells. He who cancels the vows of mankind and the decree of heaven, he will annul these, not cows, vows. Just to see that you're thinking, all right. In other words, the whole thing arose among the population at large. It wasn't rabbinic at all. Now the rabbis have to contend with it. So 5e. This is another Gaon, 8th century. He says, we do not revoke vows or annul oaths because we have not expounded on the Talmudic tractate on vows for more than 100 years. We do not comprehend the profundity of these matters, and we do not have the authority to annul vows, much less to annul oaths. It is not practiced in the 2 academies or anywhere else in all of Babylonia. There's no sage in this generation who knows how to revoke vows. You too, he writes to someone, should be strict with regard to vows and not deviate from the custom of the academies. 5f basically repeats the same thing by a student of his. And we'll jump to 5h. This is Ram Gaon, who wrote our first prayer book. And he had to decide whether to put Kol Nidre in it, because he knew people were doing it, but he hated it. So what does he say? The Holy Academy, meaning rabbis of past, sent word that this Kol Nidre is a foolish custom and it's forbidden to practice it. That's that. Don't do it. A little later, 10th century, 5i. We have seen people in the countries practicing according to the Mishnah, meaning annulling vows, and a few Gaonim, a few of the authorities, have relied on their authority to permit legal fictions on Yom Kippur Eve. But it's a grave matter to abrogate vows and oaths, God forbid. My point then is that sometimes in real life things happen. And here we have some reality about religious traditions. So what happened in effect, people wanted to do it. The rabbis forbade it. But you know, who listens to the rabbis, right? So it just got in there. And people kept on doing it. To make a long story short, eventually we made peace with it. I mean, put it in the prayer books. Since it was all in Aramaic and prayer books weren't translated, who cared? Nobody knew. And you could sing it, and the music is gorgeous. When we translated it in Reform services, we had to face up to what it said. So frequently, Reform prayer books didn't put it on at all. They just said in parentheses, Kol Nidre is chanted. You can listen to it. I could go on and tell you how it all worked out with our different prayer books and so on. But what you should see basically is the thing arose out of the people. And sometimes Jewish tradition is like every other tradition. There are parts of it we don't like. And what we do with it is a compromise, and so on. Well, all right, where are we before we get into this afternoon? This afternoon is the best as far as I'm concerned, but you know, where are we? We've looked at human nature a little bit last night. We talked about it a little bit today, too. We have paid attention last night and this morning to the first two pieties. Piety of, what's the first one? Piety of plenty. And the second one, a piety of penitence, exactly. We saw penitence grows, and now sin and sin and sin becomes full here. And so this afternoon, we're going to look at the most significant prayer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we'll talk about how do we pray when we don't believe what we are praying. Big, big, big question. That will involve us this afternoon. Until then, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.